Hey guys, welcome back. BDCKR here. We're back with Season 6, Episode 5 of our weekly P&Q&C&A&T videos. Getting right into the questions.
Well, should we explain that first for anybody who's coming to us?
That's true. This is our podcast and questions and comments and answers and talking series. The P stands for podcast because if you check the description, you'll be able to see that we have this on RSS feeds, so you can go ahead and listen to it there or here. And if you look at our feed, you will find a bonus episode with an hour and 5 minutes of content that we recorded around Christmas that you will only be able to find on our podcast feed, which so far I think only like 25 people have done. Not great numbers, but it was a lot of fun to make, and I think that comes across in the content itself. So give it a listen if you like listening to the sound of our voice and like hearing us ramble, because we do a lot of rambling in that.
It's like a ramble special.
Yeah, that's true. A little bit of a retrospective. But anyways, this isn't an ad for our podcast, especially because our podcast doesn't actually make us any money. It's not monetized. Yeah, we could not afford to take out an ad even on our own show for the podcast. So the first question of the week comes from Tauhid Ahmed. Probably mispronounced that. Tauhid
I feel like that should be Tauhid, because whenever I see like
Tauhid,
like for Rashid, for example, that I ends up being like a long E.
Maybe.
Anyways.
So if you are so inclined, let us know in the description how to pronounce your name, because we're always interested in that, and we do make our best effort to not get them wrong. But anyways, they say now multiplayer is pay to win almost. If opponent have ninja characters maxed out, you're pretty much screwed. I started playing after 2 years. Now with older characters, it's impossible to beat ninja characters.
Mm-hmm. I just want to point out too, with the gameplay that we normally have in the background, which we also have in the background now, I don't know whether it's that the most recent update is a little bit broken, which is why we were having so much trouble, or whether our device is starting to fail us. But we're having a lot of trouble where the touches don't register during the game. Mm-hmm. Mostly, actually, when we're trying to do the recording at the same time, because if I play without recording, it doesn't give me the same problem.
Yeah, because recording does actually take up, I think, a decent chunk of RAM.
Yeah, and it's crashing a bit too. So instead of our usual of just motoring through 3 ultimate runs, we're probably going to have to stop wherever we end up stopping, just because doing a lot of like just trying to get it to the end is going to be a bit longer than we're inclined to make these podcasts.
Yeah, so this is another great opportunity to hop over to the podcast, because the video here is not going to be particularly compelling.
Well, yeah, I mean, listen, the fights are still going to be fun, but they're going to be a lot more herky-jerky, I think, at times.
Yeah, so getting back to the question,
so I
the
think
pay-to-win and ninja characters.
Yeah, I think historically there's been a lot of game breakers where people have announced this character is ruining the game and it's impossible to fight. And to my memory, maybe the first one might have been Arkham Origins Deathstroke. Oh, so that's a perfect example where I got none of the taps and nothing registered on the screen during that special. So because Arkham Origins Deathstroke, when they first introduced him, when you were fighting against him, he would pretty much always get 200%, meaning his special one was always critical automatically and unblockable automatically.
Yeah, that made it really difficult to play.
And I mean, it was still winnable, but they fixed that. And then there was Luchador, Bane, Batgirl, Cloak of Destiny, League of Assassins, Knives.
Now where people would just absolutely destroy your team.
Yeah, one tag in, one special, one when you're stunned, and all of a sudden everybody else is tagging with 0 health.
Yeah. And
I don't think that the ninja characters as a group is the same kind of problem, because we've played, I mean, we'll probably see, we've got Nightwing right now, and when Tauhid was talking about it, right, that I think the biggest problem people were having with Batman was that when they do a totally defensive loadout, that he's taking hardly any damage, and his passive when he's the last man standing, it's painful fighting him if you don't have the right team.
Yeah.
But all right, so you probably saw a couple times here when Nightwing tagged in, he was draining our power. He's the only person who's a problem, I think, because the strategy right now favors the specialist and Tentu Totem, and the Nightwing's the metal Batman Ninja Nightwing's teammates that are Batman Ninja. There's too many words. Like as a class of characters, Batman Ninja there's got to be, anyways. The problem is that BN is also Blackest Night, so you can't just go BN and then. What have you done to me, Injustice?
There's just so much content. We're complaining about how much stuff there is.
So all right, so here's Batman Ninja Joker. Not a problem. Batman Ninja Batman is interesting because he's so tough normally, but on a team that you would otherwise maybe not need to have damage over time, he's the perfect case for it.
Yeah.
And when we're facing him, the strategy is really to bring in our tank, Aquaman, who also doubles as our damage over time specialist, who also doubles as a specialist, triples, I guess.
Yeah.
And you stack 3 bleeds, and even when he's got the total Gingold Soda Killer Croc companion gear loadout, as soon as you triple stack the bleed, then Wonder Woman tags in, and her special does damage almost like normal. So I don't know that that's such a problem. I'm still reserving judgment, but it doesn't feel like the game is entirely broken, but there's been precedents before where people have felt that way, and you just find a way to overcome, I think.
Yeah, it's probably hard using old characters versus new characters if you're playing from 2 years ago, and that's where your starting point is. Because I think more than pay to win, it is, because of the way power creep works, hard to get back into. There's work to be done to get your team back up to the level that it was before, and that work is mostly getting new characters, because the newer characters tend to be better.
Well, I will say something. The main advantage of the team that we're using now is the power gen from New 52 Wonder Woman, and the way that Superman acts as a tank and as a basic damage dealer because of his passive. If you were really desperate, you could switch out Injustice to Aquaman for any of the other Aquaman, because you're only using Special 1. Your specialist doesn't get the secondary benefit, so then you might want to use a different tank other than New 52 Superman. Maybe instead of a tank, a basic damage specialist. And then I don't think it's that this is not broken. I think there's still ways to work around it where you don't end up feeling like you're getting totally gypped, ripped off when you're facing a Batman Ninja team.
Yeah, so there we go. Our next question comes from Drake Pendragon. I think it would be fair to say resident challenger of our ideas. And they say, in jobs, your grades do matter a little bit because it shows an understanding of things you were taught. Affirmative action is literally the idea of racism due to low expectations because it allows individuals to obtain positions that should be given to more qualified individuals. The perfect way to move towards equality is to take race and gender off of all things and allow the most qualified individuals to get the positions. Studies in the US show that Asian students are actually the most disenfranchised by affirmative action in schools. It is about equality of opportunity rather than the equality of outcome. American conservatives want to give equality of opportunity. Everyone can apply to any college, while American liberals want equality of outcome. Everybody who applies to Harvard gets to go and doesn't have to pay for college. I do agree that having a certain level of higher education as a barrier to a job is a terrible thing, especially if somebody has experience to replace that education, i.e. if somebody served in the military as an engineer and didn't want to go to college for it, they should not need the degree when they leave the military. And I think to start, there's a lot of stuff to say about this. I think one of the interesting things is I don't think we necessarily disagree on a lot of the points. I think maybe the talking points and the rhetoric is a little bit different, but I think actually kind of our fundamental stance on what should and shouldn't happen is pretty much the same. When you're talking about how, agreeing that having a certain level of higher education as a barrier to a job is a terrible thing, to me it seems like most of the other stuff that we said actually follows logically from that point. And I think that's kind of the main conceit.
When you say you're talking about me or you're talking about Drake?
I'm talking about Drake. I think that's the main conceit that we're actually making. And I think you're right that grades do actually matter a little bit, where better grades do, I think, have some correlation with, performance.
Yes and no. I mean, all right, so here's the thing. When you were growing up, we talked to you a lot about grades and knowledge.
Yeah.
And we tried to be explicit about the idea that mastering the material was different than getting grades. And we focused on, with you, that mastering the material is more important than getting good grades. Grades are secondary, because getting marks is both a reflection of knowledge, but also the separate skill of actually getting marks, like test taking skill.
No, and that's why I actually chose my words very carefully. I said correlation, because I think people who do consistently get high grades are, there's a correlation with success, but I don't think it's necessarily because of the grades. This is what's called a third variable problem, where those two things are related to each other, but one doesn't necessarily cause the other. So being able to be successful isn't necessarily caused by having good grades, right? Or they're related, and I think there's some correlation, but it's not a complete correlation. And I think there's a totally separate skill that accounts for a lot of what is good grades, right? Which is the being able to be successful on tests. And I think the problem is that basically grades in certification, like the university that you went to, the level of schooling you had, all of those things are, if somebody has them, they're decent indicators that they have certain capabilities, that they have certain skills, but it isn't actually, truly
I think once you meet the minimum, once you meet the minimum, though, at some point the extra grades, the difference between, like, say, an 80 and 90, isn't nearly as much as you think, because the minimum qualification you need for the skills, for those particular skills, I think are not the be-all and end-all. They are not sufficient. You actually need other skills.
And we use it as a substitution. We use it as a way of measuring merit, and I think it's a really incomplete system. Yeah, and so it's a surrogate, but it's not necessarily a great surrogate. It's a useful surrogate, and one of the reasons why it's really hard to find a solution to the problem of the fact that there's a lot of disenfranchised people, and there's a lot of people who haven't really had the opportunity to be successful in the way that we measure success. There's not really a super easy solution, because you talk about, like, equality of outcome versus equality of opportunity.
I want to talk about this. Okay, yeah, go ahead.
The problem is that we can't just say, okay, we've abolished all of anything related to gender. We can't, like, for example, gender, sex, race, like all of that stuff, because the problem is, even if out of every application you strip the names and the identifying information and you try to evaluate people on merit, right? And from your comment, I guess you can correct me if this is incorrect. I don't want to make any incorrect assumptions about the argument that you're making here. But from your comment, what it sounds like you want to do is essentially just separate kind of any personal information that could bias somebody one way or another from the basically applying for opportunities, talking about schooling specifically here. And the problem is you can't separate somebody from their culture and their experiences. You can't just take their name off of it if it doesn't sound white and then assume that the rest will work itself out, because the opportunities that they've had in their lives are in part, not always, but on the average and on the whole, a reflection of the race that they are, the culture that they're from, the way that their family, and the further back you go, the more the way their family was treated is actually directly related to what race they were, right? And all of those things kind of influence it. So when you talk about people, living in poor living conditions, have less access to education, have more responsibility to actually be self-sufficient from a younger age, have to, spend their time and effort and mental energy learning on stuff that isn't necessarily school, with less opportunities to have the money to afford schooling, and all that stuff doesn't have to be tied to race, but in the world that we're currently living in, a lot of that stuff is tied to race. Like really, really unfortunately, especially in places like, North America. I know that's a problem in a lot of different places, but it's definitely a problem in North America.
Well, I think the biggest problem in North America isn't that it's there, it's that people maybe believe that it's not. So it becomes harder to actually deal with it on that sort of low level. I mean, there's big stuff too, but the low level kind of stuff where it's not. Hold on. I recently read a quote from Ta-Nehisi Coates, really brilliant writer. So he says, racism is not merely a simplistic hatred. It is, more often, broad sympathy towards some and broader skepticism toward others.
Yeah.
And why that works is because I think there's a little bit of pushback when, just as soon as you use the word racism, because of the connotation that somehow it's obvious, it's in your face, it's white sheets and white hood, you know, that kind of thing, and a burning cross. And that's racism, but that's not all of racism.
And so I think I mentioned previously about the ways that affirmative action does and doesn't work. And I think the part of the problem is that a lot of affirmative action is also basically doing the same sort of painting with a broad brush that that we run into when we have people who are being denied opportunities. Because what I think the principle of a well-intentioned, good faith affirmative action program is this: that certain people haven't had the same opportunities because of their, you know, race and culture in the state of the world as it exists. And what you're trying to do is counterbalance that by saying, well, maybe these people haven't been able to perform as well because they haven't been given the opportunity to. So what we're doing is we are trying to counterbalance the inherent opportunities that the other people applying have with the, and we're basically trying to do what our best guess is of bringing these people who have had less opportunities and who have had to struggle more for the success that they have earned. We're giving them a kind of an opportunity and assuming that if they were in better situations, they would have been more successful. And the problem is that's a big assumption, and it's not always right.
Okay, hold on. Let me reframe it a different way, though, that maybe makes it a little bit more palatable. So what you're doing, let's say we're talking specifically about jobs, and we're looking at markers for who you hope is going to be the best able to perform the job. Let's not say most qualified, because I want to touch on that maybe a little bit later, because that qualified thing is kind of loaded. But instead of thinking that somehow that you're specifically singling out these features, what it is recognizing that of all the markers that you're using, the level of expertise, the level of however you measure that particular marker, the threshold doesn't need to be that high. And when you have a large number of candidates, and the only way that you discriminate between them is by saying, well, we want these things, so the ones that do the best in these things, they just keep on getting more value, they attribute more value to these surrogates or these markers, instead of considering that the relative merit is pretty low. And instead of saying that, well, we don't care about these things, we're just picking based on race or gender or whatever, is that the race and gender is actually another marker on a different axis that gives
dealing with struggle and overcoming adversity.
No, that gives them value to the job. Like, so that they're bringing a different perspective and different set of knowledge that you couldn't get with these markers. So it's a different axis to measure how useful they will be in this job to contribute their experience, their life experience, to what you want them to do.
I think that's actually an even more kind of hopeful stance than the one I was taking, maybe.
Yeah, that's why I think you're sort of coming at it with, like, the framing that you've got is the framing that allows people to say, well, yeah, that sucks, that's no good. And if that's the only thing that you were considering, then maybe that would be a legitimate argument. That's why I'm thinking part of it is, this is what always gets me. You don't really care what somebody's mark was. You don't really care what school they went to. You just want to know that when they come to your business, that they're going to do a good job.
Yeah, and I think that's right, is that it's a really kind of complicated situation, because what you're doing is you're trying to get a complete picture of somebody's capabilities, at least as they relate to your whatever you want them to do, and it's impossible to do that. So we're basically just trying to find the right algorithm, the right way of starting from the bottom and working our way up, that uses as little information as possible to get as accurate a picture as possible of how good somebody would be of a fit. And it's really, really hard to do that. And I think a certain amount of, diversity and understanding and affirmative action is a part of it. It's just, it needs to be weighed the right way. And you know, being well-meaning, unfortunately, isn't actually enough to make the system work. And that's one of the things I think that's interesting, is it's important to point out specific flaws in programs as they exist, but instead of saying that something like affirmative action is inherently flawed, I think my stance is that it's hard. It's a very difficult thing to do, and you're not necessarily going to do it right, but I think it's a sort of difficult undertaking that is valuable and worth putting the effort into.
And maybe coming back to something that we touched on earlier was the qualified. So the phrase that Drake used was allowing the most qualified individuals, because to me that's such a loaded phrase, because what's qualification? Is it experience? Then that history of racism or sexism that's kept people out of certain positions is going to keep them out indefinitely.
Yeah.
Right? You can't get the experience if you haven't done it. So then by going only with the people who have experience, well, you're just perpetuating the same thing that brought us here. Is it based on, you know, what kind of degree you got? I mean, okay, so there are specialties that require specific university education, but a lot of them don't. And many universities don't actually teach life or job skills. So for example, in healthcare, you see nurses used to be able to do it with just with a diploma, and now you see more and more that hospitals are requiring nurses to have degrees, mainly just because they can, not because it means that they're going to be better nurses for a lot of the work that they're going to do, unless they take on an expanded role or work to the fullest capabilities of their scope of practice. You're going to basically be getting people with more qualifications, but not necessarily for the job that you want them to do.
Yeah, basically none of the stuff that I've learned so far in university looks like it's ever going to be relevant for a job.
Right.
More than in passing, more than like passing facts about it, but they're only going to be useful if the thing I'm doing happens to build on the information that I'm already learning, and even so, it would be only useful in the most sparing and fleeting of ways.
Right. So here's the thing. I mean, if you really want specific skills that are related to your work, you actually want to go to, I think in the States, it's a community college, and in Canada, it would be just college.
Yeah. Because
they would teach more job kind of relevant skills.
Yeah.
And here's the other thing. When you get picky about which school, like, and you value, oh, look, it's actually not responding. It just did that in the middle of the game. So if you're actually looking at where the degree came from, then how do you factor in legacy admissions? Which is probably one of the most obvious ways to perpetuate racism.
Actually, speaking of which school, that's an interesting thing about why affirmative action fails in a way that you wouldn't expect, where it actually sometimes can fail the people that it's trying to assist, because a lot of really competitive schools are actually not a great environment for the people who are in the bottom chunk of the student body as far as academic performance, and that's that is affirmative action admissions, but that's also a decent chunk of the student population that got in separate from affirmative action. And, you know, I mean, also the same issue applies to people who got in via the legacy program, which is that these people are used to performing very well academically, right? I mean, you can use the example of Harvard, right? Because really, even if you had some like affirmative action or a legacy student, it's still not easy to get into Harvard, right?
Right.
But so the people who are performing near the bottom, it doesn't matter at what level they're performing compared to the average. It matters at what level they're performing compared to the people visible around them. So that's their peers. So people who would be the top of their class in hundreds of other schools are at the bottom of their class in Harvard, and it turns out that where you are relative to your peers really affects your confidence and affects your overall performance, regardless of what level you are actually performing at, just in relation to the average. So it's actually, I think the study that I was looking at was specifically looking at like scientific fields like STEM and research, and looking at the number of published papers based off of where they were. And it turns out that just for this, and I mean, again, you could talk about how valid it is to measure overall success based off of a number of research papers you publish, right? And whether that's a fully accurate measure. But what was much more important was being the top of your class, no matter what university you went to. And people who went to better schools had a slight advantage. But if you were in the middle of your class at Harvard and could have been top of the class at another school, you would be more successful just to go to a school that you could be successful compared to your peers than just doing okay among some of the smartest, people in university. And whether or not you actually even consider people at Harvard to be particularly smart is, I guess, a secondary issue, because, or like how much of that is just perception and what we talked about earlier as just test taking skills and knowledge and opportunity, and how much of that is like genuinely people, I guess, being in some way better than the people who aren't going to Harvard, which is, I think, also maybe a little bit of a loaded assumption.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, completely agree.
But so that was basically a long-winded way of saying, there's definitely issues like inherent in letting people in, especially when people feel like they don't deserve it, because that would just compound any like lack of success with kind of a sense of like imposter syndrome, and that can create its own challenges.
Because here's the thing, to me, imposter syndrome is a symptom of people who are capable, and Dunning-Kruger is a symptom of people who are not.
Yeah,
and I think the exact opposite.
Yeah.
So here's the thing too. I mean, it was a great taking off point, but I also feel like Drake is starting off from a definite bias.
Yeah.
So the part where it's American conservatives want to give equality of opportunity, everyone can apply to any college, while American liberals want equality of outcome. Everyone who applies to Harvard gets to go and doesn't have to pay for college. So here's the thing. I've never heard anybody, and maybe I'm just not reading widely enough. I haven't heard any representative of the majority American liberals saying that everyone applying to Harvard should get in.
That's what one might call a straw man argument.
Yeah, all right, but the other part is, if no one has to pay for college, that's not equality of outcome. That's equality of opportunity. That literally is equality of opportunity. Because what you're doing is you're literally removing, not literally the new literally, which actually means figuratively, but the literally, you're removing a huge financial barrier to attending school. And all right, so it doesn't even remove all financial barriers, because attending school has an opportunity cost of not being able to work the hours that you're attending school and studying. Right? So what it is actually equality of opportunity, because there's a real parallel there with jobs that require unpaid internships if you want to start to get in, since that also favors people who can afford to not work for extended periods of time and still live and have afford rent and food.
Yeah, I do think that in the initial comment there is a certain amount of misrepresentation of what I would call general arguments or beliefs, or at least our specific beliefs on how things should be.
Because we're not American liberals. We're sort of Canadian liberals. I mean, even
Not
Canadian
sort of, we
conservatives.
are Canadian liberals.
Yeah, but But the problem is, liberals is actually a political party, and I'm not willing to identify as a liberal. I mean, even like a Canadian conservative, which is a party, I think skews a little bit more liberal than
America.
The American centrists. So
maybe I'm not. Yeah, I think the general party stances here are definitely less extreme on all sides.
Yeah, so what you mean, like Canadian politics are like American politics light?
Not necessarily that. Have you heard of the Overton window?
No. Well, that sounds familiar, but I don't actually remember what that means.
The Overton window is basically just the range of acceptable discourse to have in a country.
Oh, you've mentioned that. Yeah.
And so the idea is that I think the Overton window is shifted a lot further to the right, where it's what is and isn't acceptable conversation to have, and what is considered centrist belief, and what is considered further to the left, and what is considered like far right is different fundamentally in America. And at least right now, I think it's shifted a lot further to the right. And I think it's hard to say if that's because people are actually more right-wing, or just because people can be more open about their right-wing beliefs.
Yeah, maybe that's what we're seeing, right? Because it's not like, it's kind of like a spectator sport. So I'm talking about Trump. I don't live in America, but that what the election of somebody like Trump, who's pretty open about some of his biases, has empowered people whose views might otherwise be considered offensive and who were unwilling to be public about it are being public about it.
Yeah, there's an incredible video by Innuendo Studios called Death of a Euphemism on this exact topic. And what Trump has been doing, which basically says that people come up with euphemisms when when they want to say something, but they can't come say it outright, and then euphemisms are removed when it becomes acceptable to say them outright. And so some of the things that Trump has said, I think talking more about when he was actually campaigning, and what, like, comments like, Mexicans are rapists and murderers, is a total death of a euphemism, because that's not what people say, right? The euphemism was, it's about border security, which is what was meant to be kind of a stand-in for people who were worried about the other.
That's like a dog whistle.
Yeah. But when Trump came right out and said it, the conversation shifted, because all of a sudden somebody who is actually important and, helped define what political discourse was at the moment, and even more so now that he's president, somebody coming out and explicitly saying that is kind of removing that filter of euphemism. And it just shows kind of it's shifting even further what is and isn't acceptable, because even people who had the same beliefs as Trump before weren't allowed to say them. They had to say something else as a stand-in, so that people who weren't as extreme as them would still be able to nod along and agree and pretend it meant something else. Whereas
polite company.
Yeah. It's so that's a really good video, and because it's scripted, and also because the person understands political philosophy much better than I do. Innuendo Studios is the right person to go if you want to hear a really intelligent kind of breakdown of that.
Okay, thanks for that recommendation. All right, so maybe you can send me that link. I want to take a look at that.
Oh yeah, Innuendo Studios has a lot of really good content.
Okay.
About the alt-right too, just in general.
Okay.
Some really good stuff. Okay. There we go. I think we talked for a very long time about this. We have another comment still from Jake Pendragon, and they say, Into the Spider-Verse was the lowest earning of all the Spider-Man movies, and they play it as an excuse to piss on Peter Parker. Aquaman is actually great because it makes Aquaman to be a hero. They make Mara awesome, but not make it out to be that she's awesome because she's a woman. That joke from Jason Momoa, the one about the book, I'm adding that as an aside, and ripping out the end pages, is funny if you have a good relationship with somebody. It is something that you wouldn't do to someone on the first day you meet them, but having been deployed with guys, that sounds like the kind of joke that guys I've been with after deployment and was close with.
Man, all right, so shorter comment, but there's so much I want to unpack in this.
Oh, wow, yeah.
Do you want to start by saying we saw Into the Spider-Verse over the weekend?
Yeah, we saw Into the Spider-Verse, and we liked it a lot. I don't want to say too much because spoilers, but the art style was really good. The story was compelling and interesting. The way that they handled Spider-Man's backstory and used it almost as a compare and contrast rather than like a story of inherent value by itself was really cool.
There was a couple things I really loved about it. I loved that it didn't take the route where it had to belabor the origin story.
Yeah.
And they used it as used parts of it as sort of shorthand to introduce each of the other characters.
Yeah, that's what I was saying, where the important parts of the story wasn't actually any individual aspect of it. It was how they were different from each other.
Yeah. I also loved that there was a dynamic quality to the filming. Like I was always happy to see, when the CGI got good enough, when the special effects got good enough that you could actually have live action superhero movies. I mean, I grew up watching, Peter Hammond, the guy from Sound of Music, playing Spider-Man in a poorly fitting suit that looked just goofy. And with, I don't know. It was just, if you see the picture of the first one of the first Thor movies, I mean, it was ridiculous. So there's a joy in seeing live action, but it's missing that dynamic quality that you see in comic books. And I feel like this, I mean, obviously there's an advantage when it's animated, but it really came across that there was just such an energy to it that I missed from, live action superhero movies that came across really strongly in this.
Addressing the lowest earning of all the Spider-Man movies, I think the amount of money something makes isn't necessarily a great sort of marker of measuring value or measuring how good something is, because I mean, I think sometimes even critics and looking at kind of the average opinion of the people isn't always even a good way of measuring how good something is, necessarily, or especially not measuring its artistic value. But I think like measuring how successful it was financially is a few steps removed from kind of overall quality. So I mean, I really, really enjoyed the movie. I've heard nothing but good things from all the people that I've talked to or heard online talking about the movie, and to me that's a pretty good marker of quality, especially I like me personally enjoying it.
Yeah. Oh, for sure, because this one to me was way better than any of the Tobey Maguire Spider-Man movies.
Oh yeah, and the reference to the Tobey Maguire Spider-Man movies and how ridiculous some of the scenes was actually quite funny in this movie. It really felt like a love letter to Spider-Man in a lot of ways, and I think they do actually kind of play Peter Parker off as a bit of a loser in a lot of subtle ways, but I didn't really mind it because
But that's how he was in the comic. Like, he was a bit of a sad sack. In his real life, he had so much trouble. He was getting beat up by Flash. Like, I mean, I'm talking about, like, original Steve Ditko, Stan Lee. He was beat up by Flash. He couldn't get the girl. The one girl that he was close to ended up getting killed. He was so frustrated that he at one point decided to give up.
Oh, so the parallel that I'm drawing to that is the way that BBC's Sherlock made Sherlock kind of a dink, and everybody was like, oh, it's such like a bold new direction to go, and some people were like mad about making him a bit of a dink, and then they came out and were like, no, actually we're being more accurate to the source material because he's been kind of mythologized, but if you see the way that Arthur Conan Doyle wrote him, he was always a bit of a dink. Like, that was actually like part of his character.
Yeah. And there was a really great story. I mean, again, not necessarily the most popular view, but there was a storyline where Peter Parker and Mary Jane are up against Mephisto, who's some sort of like Lord of the Netherworld, and it was the story that they used to break up Mary Jane and Peter. And to me, that's kind of pissing on Peter Parker too, but it was a great story. It fit in with the way Peter Parker has always been, and the fact that he actually got married to Mary Jane was actually a different direction. That was somebody taking Peter Parker in a direction that wasn't traditional for him, and that was okay too, because there were interesting stories there. But yeah, I don't know that you can really, I don't think it's a fair criticism to say somehow that just because a character doesn't get to be like a super successful hero is somehow being unfaithful to who he is.
Yeah, and I mean, he was a bit of a comedic relief character. He was pretty fallible. He was not, I mean, particularly likable for a decent chunk of the movie. Although I wouldn't go so far as to say unlikable. But, you know, I think he served kind of his role really well in the story, and I think he was integral. Like, he was one of the kind of more main characters, and he had his own sort of redemption arc too.
So, all right, so I've been dancing around this, but I just realized the movie actually gives us away. I was trying to avoid a spoiler, but really, it's Into the Spider-Verse. It's a multiverse story. So not all the Peter Parkers were like that. There was the successful one, right?
Yeah, the successful one from his own universe, but we can't talk about him because I think that is actually a spoiler.
Yeah, but it's just that, I mean, these are a bunch of different spider people.
Yeah, and I think I mean, really, I think the kind of looking at Peter Parker as the only Spider-Man, I think everybody in here, although they don't kind of value them equally in terms of plot or you know, character development, I think all the Spider-Men in this are kind of equally Spider-Man, right? As far as the actual like narrative is concerned, they're all equal part Spider-Man, and I think the fact that they play Peter Parker as kind of the crappy Spider-Man, if we're gonna go that far, is a good choice, because there's a lot of movies where Peter Parker is just the Spider-Man, And so it's cool to have him, at least in terms of capabilities, take a bit of a backseat on this one and kind of showcase Spider-Man more as like a mantle, right? And more of the kind of fundamental idea of Spider-Man and the ways, and all the different Spider-Men kind of being able to take a little bit more center stage in terms of showing off who they are and what they are. Because we kind of already know a lot of what basic Spider-Man is, right? What he can do, what his motivations are. And so I think just from a story perspective, if you just said, hey, I'm Spider-Man and I'm normal and I'm the one that you've been seeing in way too many movies in the past little while, like the past couple decades, and also in almost all of the comics, I don't think it would be as interesting a story. I think it's cool to have, you know, like even normal Spider-Man not be exactly normal Spider-Man, right?
So 2 points I want to make. It's not even a little bit right now that Flashpoint Aquaman is facing Injustice 2 Aquaman, because we're talking about that, right?
Yeah.
And the second thing is that the original appeal that set Spider-Man apart from other superhero comics at the time was that Peter Parker was an insecure teenager. He was an everyman. And so he was fallible. He had problems. He wasn't the, Superman in tights where he was just so good that you had to make up new stuff like magic for him to be beaten, so that there'd be any kind of dramatic tension because, well, Superman can handle everything.
Yeah, and he wasn't just fallible in the fact that he had meaningful connections with other people, because I think that's often what they also try to do, is try to appeal to the humanity of whatever, like, invincible character it is, where it's not even that they couldn't win the fight, it's just that they can't fight because if they do, something bad will happen to the people they care about.
Right. So, and can I want to get back to another point that you made about popularity, because I completely agree with that. There are so many books, for example, that I love, which haven't gotten the attention they deserved because they just didn't reach the audience, although they're brilliant. They're absolutely brilliant. And books are orders of magnitude smaller audience than TV shows.
Yeah. There's also like really great digital media, especially that I can find that has not a lot of viewers, but I absolutely love, that I think is really good content that just hasn't found its niche, or maybe has found its niche, but it's just a really small niche, and the niche can barely support the kind of level of quality that the person creating it is infusing into their stuff.
Right. Oh, favorite TV show of all time, mine, is Cheers. It was hugely unsuccessful the first season. Got good reviews, and it didn't find its audience until summer reruns, and it hit its second season, but there's nothing to me that compares to the writing and the acting in the first season. That was absolutely brilliant.
Arrested Development,
yes,
was critically acclaimed, but didn't have great numbers, and it got canceled and then brought back not great, unfortunately. They kind of boofed it, but
Princess Bride. It was not a box office success, and I looked this up. It did less than 31 million worldwide. The fact that it came out in an era where the VCR was relatively popular and being able to buy movies and rent movies was a thing. I mean, if it come out before that, I think it never would have found the audience that it did. I mean, 31 million is like nothing. I mean, all right, the other thing that saved it was its budget was only 15 million.
Oh, Firefly.
Yes, absolutely.
Lots of stuff has been not super successful financially or just by whatever metric you're using, and still been very good media. Freaks and Geeks.
Oh, I love Freaks and Geeks.
Yeah.
That was such a brilliant show.
So I guess if you don't like something, the idea that it's not successful is kind of a decent proof. But
that's a Trump thing, right? Where his best insult is that, you're unsuccessful, you're
irrelevant. Oh, like New York Times, right? I think he said something about,
Yeah. But getting back to the original Jason Momoa point, making it more concrete, I think tearing out the pages of anyone's books is just a plain crappy thing to do. I don't care who you are, what kind of joke it is, when you're being that destructive of something that matters to somebody. I mean, I wanted to come up with an analogy, and I'm totally blanking on it, because
I think because we're both readers, the idea of ripping pages out of a book is just viscerally unpleasant.
Yeah, I mean, if you want to make somebody feel bad, which is what you're doing if you stop someone from finishing that story, like unexpectedly, even they're stuck, right? Feeling crap momentarily is bad enough as a joke if you do it for one moment, but doing it when they'll be stuck feeling bad for hours, like Amber Heard would have been in her harness, waiting, and so you've destroyed the book, which is awful. You're making her feel bad.
That they can't get the ending, yeah.
Right, for extended period of time, that puts them in my, there's a better poop list for sure. Because, you rip a book, you can't fix it. You can't take a book and then stick the pages back in. It doesn't work, right?
Yeah, the only time I've ever torn pages out of a book is in grade school. There was somebody they were literally straight up recycling like a dictionary. I think it was old and like decrepit, and I tried ripping some pages out just because it was literally like going straight into the recycle, and it just felt fundamentally wrong. Like it wasn't even like a particularly enjoyable experience.
So I've ripped books before. I've done phone books, but that was more, I mean, again, it was like it was something that was going to be recycled. It wasn't useful anymore, and so that was something that I did just for fun, just to prove that I could.
Yeah.
And I guess maybe taking it back even more specifically to Drake, where Drake was comparing it to the kind of jokes they play on each other when they're deployed. So let's imagine, I'm talking to you now, let's imagine that your friends would play jokes on you so that you would realize after you were deployed that the only entertainment you had packed for whatever downtime you had that had been destroyed. So you were stuck out there. You just realized that whatever you had for however long your deployment was gone. I don't know, cards, books, music, whatever.
Yeah.
I can't imagine that's okay. And I guess I feel really bad for Drake that this is the kind of people that he considers, like, he would consider friends.
And I mean, I think there's something to be said for, like, being rougher or just being okay with more, being more permissive for what your friends do, like sort of a no-hold-barred thing. But I think it just doesn't have a lot of redeeming qualities as a joke in this case. The joke is just kind of, it sucks, right? Like there's no...
Right.
It's not clever, really. There's no, like, punchline. The main joke is just making things difficult for somebody else. And I think there's the right kinds of these jokes. I think some, like, elaborate pranks where you lead somebody on and make them waste time can be funny when done right, and this may be quality. This type of thing isn't wholly irredeemable, but just this specific example doesn't have a lot of kind of entertaining content, and I'm not opposed to necessarily, if every party involved is okay with it, jokes of this ilk, but just stuff like this specifically seems just like it. Seems like there's very little to redeem it. It's mostly just, this is making life a little worse for you,
Yeah, and I think we've been pretty clear from the very beginning, right? It's not our attitude towards life or whatever in general.
Yeah. So it's possible that when Drake was talking, he meant stuff qualitatively similar to this, but not really like this. But for this specific example, it just sort of seems mean and destructive, and also like Jason Momoa is not a reader. Right. Because I can't imagine somebody who appreciates and likes books doing that to a book.
Yeah, and here's the thing. The kicker to me is really, it's not like your victim can really laugh about it. I mean, she might be able to brush it off and say, it's not a big deal, it was just a joke. But it's not the kind of joke that lets the person who's getting pranked have fun at the same time. If you know what I mean?
That's true. Tom Scott, I think, did a prank, and when he was describing it, he said at the like something about it which I thought was really cool and smart and also thoughtful, which is that he said, for any good prank, I think there has to be an opt-out, even if the person doesn't know. So, like, even if the person doesn't know that they're specifically opting in or out. So he had this prank where he heard somebody at a bar who sounded exactly like his friend, and he had them do like a call from the future to really freak them out and say something about like what they had to do, and because it sounded so much like his friend totally bought it and left a voicemail, and he was talking about the opt-out because that was all he was going to do, and then he was going to try to set it up so that the friend actually made the call because he said it's a message from the future, and so he tried to set it up so that the loop would complete, so that in the future the friend would actually make the call and send the call back to himself from the past, quote unquote. And the friend opted in because he was like freaking out about it on Twitter, and he's like, oh, this is such a weird experience, and then the friend said, if this is a prank, nobody tell me this is incredible, right? Like I want
that was like he opted. That's a cool kind of opt-in, because
he's like, because I want to live in a world where I believe this is possible more than I want to have somebody kind of pull back the curtain right now.
Oh, that's a good, all right, so the pull back the curtain is a perfect analogy, right? It's like magic. Like when you watch magic, some people want to know how the trick is played, and some people just want to believe that it's possible in the world, right?
So I think, obviously that's a very kind of explicit version of the opt-in, but I think the book ripping thing is something that there's no opt-in for, right? You don't get to pick. And I think when you do that to somebody, I think there's not a lot of kinds of relationship establishing that you can do beforehand that makes that okay, or that serves as an opt-in for that kind of prank. I think it's very difficult to kind of be able to gauge that before actually doing it and looking at the reaction, and that's why I think it's not a great prank.
Agreed. Yep. I haven't even seen Tom Scott before, but I totally agree with that.
Tom Scott does some really, really cool stuff, and I like him as a person, as far as I can tell from his videos. That's a slippery slope.
Yeah,
but
no
as a content creator, his sensibilities as a content creator are definitely something that I can really get behind.
Right. Okay.
Okay. Oh, wow. We are running low on time, actually. Should we do this one last question here?
I think we can get through this.
Okay, yeah, because this one's a little quicker. This question comes from Jim Halpert. And Jim says, I don't have any questions, but I just want to say I've watched your videos for a very long time, and I enjoy them. While I do come here for injustice, I really do also enjoy the conversations you have. I think it's cool the dynamic you two have, and it's not that common on YouTube. It's also funny, I had no idea what your connection was until somewhat recently. Keep up the great work.
Thanks. But I think you're probably better positioned to answer this question because you watch way more YouTube than I do. And so what's your impression of the dynamic that's more typical on YouTube when people are talking with each other?
I think it's just maybe louder. I think it tends to be a lot more kind of out there, maybe a little bit less introspective.
More exaggerated, you mean?
Maybe more exaggerated, also just more produced. Because I think like what we have here is just something closer to just genuine conversation with a little bit of like framework around it. And I think that is not necessarily super common on YouTube. And for better or for worse, I think there's only so much of this content that needs to exist of the kind that we're making, and I think there always can be more. And there's always people who are willing to listen to more. Thank you, by the way, for listening to us. But I think there's also kind of limits to this format, and maybe limits to the success of this format, because I mean, I think the people listening to us think we're interesting, but I think there's a certain like requirement of being interesting, because if you're not on a fundamental level, it's just listening to other people talk in a way that you can only participate in a really limited way. And I think that's kind of a hard balance to strike and be like good and reliably good and also interesting, or
really just worth the time. Like sometimes you don't even need to be good. I mean, listen, we have somebody, like you said, in our family who listens to us to fall asleep, so you don't need to be good, you just need to be there.
That's true. Okay, it looks like we're a little out of time. Do you have any kind of other closing thoughts on our dynamic on YouTube?
Maybe just that I think some of it has to really do with the kind of presentation that people aspire to, like the kind of public face versus their private face versus what they are actually like. I mean, they're just different aspects of it, but when you're specifically creating media that you know is going to be consumed by a larger audience, then you're already censoring yourself a little bit, and you're choosing the kind of face that you want to show people. And I was never, I'm just too tired to actually create any other kind of persona, or to be over that top, to, you know, make everything exciting when it's not. So
what like an old man way of justifying your behaviors.
Yeah, that's it. That's my last thought.
Okay, that's great. Perfect. Okay, so we should mention we have a Patreon, and if you want to support what we do, patreon.com/BDCKR, or clicking on our face at the bottom right corner at the end of this video. But as always, we like to first and foremost, more than just promoting ourselves, give a huge thank you to the people who have decided to support us. We have another message this week from iProphet, and this is unfortunate. I'll pull back the curtain a little bit. A very long time ago, when iProphet was sending them in more regularly, I had a list of possible segment titles for what iProphet was. It was initially the Comedy Corner, and I don't have them with me, so I'm going to say this week on the segment iProphet's Carnival of Cackles. I don't think I've used that one before, but I have a document on a computer that is not currently with me with all of the other things that I could be saying here. We've got a message from iProphet, which is a joke, appreciated as always. This one is, why is the Joker no fun at a party?
I don't know. Why is he no fun at a party?
He always has to have the last laugh.
Ooh, Alan Moore, Brian Boland.
Okay, so there we go. Thank you so much, iProphet, and a huge thank you to all of our patrons. Why don't you take it away?
All right, big thank you to Console Peasant, Eddy G, and Edwin Felix, who are supporting us at the highest last word tier. iProphet, who's supporting us at the Your Message Here tier, which he took advantage of this episode. And Shawn, Farrell, and Daniel Simonson, who support us on the credited level.
So thank you guys so much, and thank you to all of you for listening or watching. We'll see you guys next time.
Komoda.